Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. Mics are working and everything. First of all, thank you for staying seated and wanting to participate in this next session. I really want to talk about the impact of technology on the future of the SRN, or the Strategic Road Network. I'm joined here by three of my colleagues. We have spent quite a bit of time talking and preparing for this session, so hopefully you're going to be finding this very interesting. Firstly, Mike Wilson from Highways England. Mike is the Chief Highways Engineer. He'll explain a little bit more about what that means and what his role is for those that don't know Mike already. I'm also joined by Jennifer Schooliong, the Director of the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction. So very relevant in the whole area of kind of smart technology from a roads and a highways perspective. And then finally, Jamie Airbib. Jamie is the co-founder of Rethinkx. Whether you kind of define the X, it'd be interesting how you pronounce the X. Is it X or 10? To be a bit kind of timely and current on that. That's a little bit of a joke for those that aren't into Apple, but anyway. But I guess first of all, who am I as well? Rob Wallis, the Chief Executive of TRL. For those that don't know who TRL is, the Transport Research Laboratory. We have been around since the 1930s, originally part of government and privatized 20 years ago. What do we do at its most basic level? We are an innovation business, all predicated on evidence-based research, but we try to drive impactful innovation into transport and mobility. We've been doing this not just in the UK for organizations in partnership with Highways England, but actually in 145 different countries around the world. But I won't pitch too much about who TRL is. If you're interested, we have a stand over there with the big orange stuff going on, so please come and talk to us. I guess what I'd really like to talk about is the impact of technology on the Strategic Road Network. From our perspective, we see this as an absolute revolution. If for any of us that can think back that far or look at some of the old photos, you go back to 1900, 1910, and you see pictures of streets where you've got horses and carriages getting people around, and in the 1910 through 1920, you see the same streets with automobiles of some sort with internal combustion engines. Within about a 10-year period, an absolute revolution in transportation. And then from that point onwards, we've seen what I would describe as evolution. If you think back just over the last 10 years, the revolution we've all seen from a societal point of view of the introduction of the smartphone rather than the traditional mobile phones, and the impact that has had on all of us and the way we work and the way we live. And I think right now we're about to see a similar revolution in transport and mobility with the introduction of connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, the whole ultra-low emission agenda around getting electrification or other alternative propulsion systems and getting rid of traditional combustion engines. And finally, and probably the most interesting, is the whole new ride-sharing or smart mobility scenarios of not even owning vehicles, but actually using vehicle or mobility services. So from TRL's perspective, that whole revolution is happening. How fast it's going to happen, is it 5 years, is it 10 years, is it 15, is not really clear. But I think for us, this is a very, very interesting time. A lot of talk is about smart cities and not the way cities are connected, and hence the link to smart infrastructure, technology-enabled infrastructure for interurban. I'd like to now introduce Mike. He'll say a little bit about more what his role is, but also what his point of view, what Highways England's point of view is on the role of technology going forwards. So Mike, over to you, please.
And so I'm not going to really answer the question, actually, because I think that's predicting the future is a real challenge. What I will do is, I don't know if I have a slide, is I'm looking for technology to provide solutions to problems. And I've got two up here, and click it again. Hurrah. So 2 problems for you. So the first problem is on the left-hand side as you're looking at it, which is the age of the Strategic Road Network. And you will see huge construction in the 1960s, 70s, emerging into the early 80s. And that creates problems in its own right. So we have a network that is 40, 50 years old. It is being asked to deliver more than it was ever asked to do, or whatever we asked it to do or envisaged it might need to do. So both in terms of the capacity and its availability is beyond what our imagining was when these schemes were originally conceived. So we are managing an aging network. And how do we ensure that that network continues to provide the levels of service that we need it to going forward? So real challenge around asset management and predicting the future in terms of actually what investment we need to do to keep that network running and operational. The second graph up there is a prediction of traffic growth. And as you will see, the Department for Transport, whose graph this belongs to, predicts that there is an increase in traffic growth. Now, those of you who travel here on the network today will wonder what additional capacity there is for all these additional vehicles that there might be. I suppose whether this is right or not, what it is actually demonstrating is an increase in demand for mobility. And I believe that technology can help us utilize that network to deliver increasing levels of service. So I suppose there are three particular areas, part of what we call our concept of operations, but actually how we manage demand. So actually how we provide good quality information to road users to make good decisions about their journeys, whether to travel now, when to travel, or indeed, is their journey really necessary, and which route to take. Maximizing utilization of that network. So we're seeing things like platooning and other type technologies being used to actually reduce headways so we get greater usage of the actual network itself. And then managing availability, so maximizing the availability of that network so that actually the network is able to work as hard as it can to deliver that mobilization. So just a very quick summary. I could talk for a long time about this, but actually rather than focus on what the technology is, as an asset owner and a service provider, what I'm looking for is a technology to help me deliver the demands and the services that the users provide.
So I'm the director of the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction in Cambridge, and really we are very interested in getting the sort of the smart, bright ideas that are coming out of research and out of SMEs into deployment across our infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I mean all the kind of big economic infrastructure. In doing that, our focus tends to be on the static physical stuff. So if I can get my slide up, there we go. So we think about how smart infrastructure solutions can help us better design our assets and construct them and then operate and manage them throughout their life, and also then set them in their urban context. So what kinds of infrastructure do we need to meet the emerging demands? And for us, smart infrastructure is simply what you get when you combine the digital with the physical. So using sensors and data analytics and all that kind of thing to give us better information about our assets, whether that is how they're performing against their design or what condition they're in after 20, 30, 40 years of use, and so on. So we underpin all of that with looking at use and development of sensor systems, making them rugged enough for the environment, making them reliable enough for the purposes that we need them for, and then looking at data-driven decision-making. And it's this data-driven decision-making which is really crucial to what we're doing. We can take data from all kinds of sources. We can use satellite data, we can use mobile phone data, the chaps from Waze earlier talking about the sort of social media sourced information. All of that is data that we can use to better understand the state of our transport networks. And the trouble with data is it's only any use when you do something useful with it. So in the data pyramid behind me, what you can see is that we've got data from any kind of source coming in at the bottom, but we've then got to manage that data And when you're looking at infrastructure assets which have extended lifetimes, that's much more complicated because you have to manage the chain of custody of data from one organisation to the next. You have to bring together very diverse sorts of data which are being collected over very diverse timeframes to answer a bunch of actually quite diverse questions. And so we're also looking at how data analytics and decision-making tools can then help inform the decision maker to make better, more informed decisions. So what kinds of decisions might we be making, and what are the challenges? Well, as I said earlier, we tend to focus on the physical infrastructure that underpins the services. So, you know, mobility is challenged if our road network and our structures are not in a good condition. So one of my favourite little pictures is this one of the protest recently of the local community that was so fed up with the potholes that they floated rubber duckies on them. But how could the managers of that bit of the road network have done a better job of looking at the condition of that bit of road, how often it's being used, etc. So one of the projects that we've got going on, which was just to highlight the sort of diversity of things that we do, is those of you that have been to North America will recognise San Francisco behind me. So what we've got there is a map of how fast different bits of the road network in San Francisco are degrading based on observations over the last 20 years or so. And we then overlay that with information about where each of those roads are in terms of, you know, are they carrying public transport networks, what level of usage are they seeing, and add on to that information about things like the weather and other factors that will affect the condition of that road to enable then, in that case, the managers of that city road network to make informed decisions about where they repair the road next. Do they repair the road where actually there's the biggest pothole, or are they more worried about the bits of the road with the strategic assets on? So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at.
So I'm James Airbib. I'm one of the co-founders of Rethinkx, which is a not-for-profit think tank based out in San Francisco. We're not transport experts at all. We are essentially students of technology disruption. So we study technology disruptions and look at the implications and try and help decision makers deal with the implications of disruption. And so when we apply our disruption framework to transportation, we get to a very different point of view than most other mainstream analysts. We published a report a few months ago on this, which caused some controversy. But what we see in transportation is essentially two different disruptions. One that is really just a technology substitution, the electric vehicle replacing the gasoline vehicle. Now, in technology terms, that's more of a substitution. Nothing really changes. You still own your car, you still drive it, you still have to park it, insure it, you bear the cost of ownership, sits idle 95% of the time. And you still, car manufacturers are still competing on the upfront cost of the vehicle, you know, performance, styling, brand, so on and so forth. And it's a very gradual disruption. In terms of cost and value, there's never anything much in it. EVs get cheaper over time, maybe slightly better, but it's a very slow disruption. It disrupts only new car sales. The real disruption, and the thing that we think is going to drive disruption far faster, is transport as a service. This is a concept of autonomous electric vehicles driving around in fleets, essentially robo-taxis. You don't own them, you just access when you need them. And that changes everything. It changes the metrics and the behavior, the incentives in the market. People are competing on cost per mile and availability. Upfront cost becomes far less important. It's just one factor in that cost per mile. And the real driver of this disruption is the economics. So what happens on day one, the day we get autonomous vehicles allowed on the roads and these fleets in operation, you get a vastly cheaper form of transport. And the reason you get a cheaper form of transport is really around vehicle degradation. An electric vehicle has about 20 moving parts in the powertrain. A gasoline engine has, a gasoline powertrain has maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of moving parts. And that causes heat, friction, vibration, the things that cause degradation. And what that means is you get a far shorter vehicle lifetime for a gasoline engine. The work we've done on electric vehicles shows that we can get at least 500,000 miles out of an electric vehicle. And possibly once the incentives change and we're driving towards longer lifetime, you're no longer selling vehicles, the owners of the vehicles are paying all the costs, and they're incentivized to create a longer-lasting vehicle. You're going to get million-mile cars. So you're going to spread the cost of a vehicle over 1 million miles and get a dramatically lower cost. And of course, you get much lower maintenance costs because these things don't degrade so much, cheaper fuel, cheaper insurance, cheaper capital, cheaper interest payments because you're doing 100,000 miles a year in these vehicles instead of 10,000 miles a year. So more efficient all around. So you get to a point where the cost of transport gets so low, it can potentially be free once you can begin to monetize your user base. There are all kinds of things we might do that Google and Facebook already do to monetize the user base, give away their product. And we might well see that in transportation. So that very low-cost form of transport disrupts not just new car sales, but the existing fleet. We think people begin to abandon or sell their vehicles because it's just far cheaper to take one of these cars. And people value their time, of course. You don't have to drive. You can do all kinds of other things. And that disruption looks very different. So this is the second slide I wanted to show. The bottom two lines are essentially the forecast that we see, the band of forecasts we see for electric vehicle adoption in terms of the market share. The red line is our forecast for autonomous electric vehicles in fleets in the USA, and it drives a much faster adoption. And once adoption gets underway, the other thing that really accelerates this are these feedback loops. So we try and capture the complexity of the system. The fact that autonomous electric vehicles in fleets, transport as a service, will get ever cheaper, ever better, ever more efficient, and the reverse will happen for privately owned gasoline engines. So the way to transform transportation is really through autonomy. Once we get vehicle autonomy, this is the real disruption.
I guess one particular question, Jamie, I had is this. You mentioned that 95% of the vehicles kind of parked most of the time, and then you're talking about the scenario of these electric vehicles having a 500,000-mile life. So if we get to a point where vehicles last a lot longer and potentially there's a lot less of them, what is that going to do to the automotive industry?
I mean, it's not great, to be honest. I mean, the existing auto value chain, I think, gets turned on its head. I mean, I think all the way through it, everything gets commoditized. There's no real brand value. You're not competing on things like performance and so on and so forth. So you get, in terms of vehicle manufacturing, it's a kind of commoditized, low-margin industry. And all the way through the chain, even in terms of the operating system, you might end up with an open-source operating system, that the brains of the electric vehicle, certainly what Baidu are trying to do right now and so on. And that might be, very low margin. And even the platform, the Uber, the interface with the customer might be very low margin as well. You might have open source versions of that. So the real battle we think in the automotive industry in this world is going to be in terms of monetizing the user base. How do you create value from that, the billions of miles, certainly in the US, that are going to be traveled every year, and you have a captive audience? And that, in a competitive market, that revenue will largely be passed on to the customer in terms of, in the form of lower prices. And that's really what drives the cost down dramatically. And we think in that kind of market, to be frank, it's potentially the Silicon Valley companies who do well. But clearly, automobile companies can adapt, but they have to move fast.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman here, please, if I can.
Hi, Liam Ryan from Atkins.
Hi, Liam.
What are the potential brakes on the adoption of electric vehicles? Is it battery life? Is it having sufficient generation distribution capacity? What is it?
So I mean, range in a transport as a service world, range kind of disappears as an issue. You can have all kinds of other solutions, and you've probably got a centralized charging structure. You're not going to ever build that distributed network to every home and every office. So most of the barriers we see in private ownership of EVs in rolling those out disappear. It's a far easier transition. The real challenge is autonomy. How do we get autonomy? And our scenario is entirely dependent on autonomous vehicles being allowed on the road. And there's a lot of uncertainty around both the date and the kind of infrastructure planning we might need for that. You might have more to say on that.
Absolutely. I think the challenge for us is, in terms of autonomous vehicles, we do see the benefits of them, in terms of safety alone. But the challenge is actually the migration towards that and the mixed fleet, and actually and you're starting to see behaviors that are part of that transition, autonomous vehicle baiting, because what they might do and how they might respond as part of that transition. That'll need to be something that we manage, but actually people will get bored of it soon. And I think the challenge is just how we move through the various levels of automation, and indeed, some of the challenges that some of those levels provide, such as actually, if there is a situation where the autonomous vehicle cannot work, cannot assimilate the data, cannot take action, and then hands it back to the driver who has been asleep or reading the paper, how is that process going to work? Now, it's something that's, the airline industry have worked their way through, and I'm sure that we will work our way through that. But at the moment, there is quite a lot of uncertainty about actually, what that might mean and how quickly it might happen.
Chris Rampley from the Road Haulage Association. I was similar. I was looking at the capacity for electricity and charging, particularly for the commercial vehicle industry, whether the national grid is going to be able to cope. And secondly, you're talking about autonomous vehicles. We will still need to have drivers to make the deliveries to the point of delivery point.
Yes. I was trying to work out if that was a question or a point of view. I think there's this transition around autonomy. I mean, there's lots of companies, of course, working on autonomous systems and trialing them and looking at the implications of those, including TRL, but many others as well. And of course, the work that Mike mentioned on platooning. But I think also intelligent infrastructure is a critical point. I mean, to what extent are we looking at electrifying the network? And is the electrification strategy about charging points, or is it about some other means of embedded electrification in the road network or in cables and so on? There's lots of different companies looking at different technical solutions, particularly for heavy goods vehicles, which broadly can't carry a big battery load because that undermines their carrying load. I think that is unresolved at the moment, and there's a lot of research, a lot of different opinions into that area at the moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I've got to keep time, unfortunately. I'd love to keep talking, and I know our team would, but thank you very much for your time.